Chapter 11. The man tried to jerk himself free, but the detective's fingers closed tightly about his wrist. "There is no use making a scene, my man," he said, still speaking in French, his voice stern but pitched in a low key. "You are Ivan something or other, and you know of the murder of your master, so come along." "It's a mistake," protested the other volubly in the same language. His words slurred into each other in his excitement. "I am not the man you take me for. I am Pierre Bazard, a jeweller of Paris, and I have my credentials. I will not submit to this abominable outrage. I know nothing of Monsieur Grell. You shall not arrest me." Heldon Foyle cut him short. He had, without the appearance of force, quietly forced his prisoner outside the restaurant and signalled to a passing taxicab. "I am not arresting you," he said, ignoring the protestations of the other. "I am going to detain you till you give a satisfactory explanation of your reason for leaving Mr. Grell's house on the night of the murder." They were on the edge of the pavement close to the cab. Ivan, with a quick oath, wheeled inward and struck savagely at the superintendent's face. Foyle's grip did not relax. He merely lowered his head, seemingly without haste, and as the man swung forward, with the momentum of the blow, jabbed with his own free hand at his body. So neatly was it done that passers-by saw nothing but an apparently drunken man collapse on the pavement in spite of the endeavours of his friend to hold him up. The whole breath had been knocked out of Ivan's body by those two swift body blows. Before he could recover, Foyle had lifted him bodily into the cab. "King Street," he said quietly to the driver, and sat down opposite to Ivan, alert and watchful. "Sorry if I hurt you," he apologised. "It will be all right in a minute. It has only upset your wind a little. That will pass off." Ivan, his hands pressed tightly to the pit of his stomach, groaned. Presently he straightened himself up, and Foyle, calmly ignoring the assault, produced a cigar case. "Have a cigar? I've no doubt you'll be able to make things all right when we get to the station. There's nothing to worry about. You will just have a little talk with me, and as soon as 1 or 2 points are cleared up, you'll be able to go." The case was struck angrily aside. Foyle smiled, and although his whole body was taut in anticipation of any fresh attempt at violence, he quietly struck a match and lit one himself. "As you like," he said imperturbably. "They're good cigars. I have them sent over to me by a friend direct from Havana." All the while he was speaking he was scrutinising the man who had been Grell's valet with deliberate care. Ivan was sleek and well groomed, with a dark face and prominent cheekbones that betrayed his Caucasian origin. The brows were drawn tightly in a surly frown, a heavy dark moustache hid the upper lip, and though the shoulders were sloping, he was obviously a man of considerable physical strength. Foyle felt that it was going to be no easy matter to win this man's confidence, yet he was determined to do so. Beyond the fact that he had vanished when the murder was discovered, there was nothing so far to suggest that he was the actual culprit. Certain it was, however, that he must have knowledge of matters which would prove valuable. If he would volunteer the information, well and good. The detective did not wish to have to question him, for such a course, however advisable it might appear, could be made to assume an ugly look in the hands of the astute counsel, should the man be charged with the crime. Where by French or American methods a statement might have been extracted by bullying or by cross-examination, here it had to be extracted by diplomacy if possible. Sullen and silent, Ivan alighted from the cab as it drew up under the blue lamp outside King Street Police Station. He passed arm in arm with Foyle up the steps. With a nod to the uniformed inspector in the outer office, the superintendent led him into the offices set apart for the divisional detachment of the Criminal Investigation Department. A broad-shouldered man with side whiskers, who was writing at a desk, looked up as they entered. "Good morning, Mr. Norman," said Foyle. "This gentleman wants to tell me something about the Grell case. Just give him a chair, will you, and send in a shorthand writer who understands French to take a statement." "I shall make no statement," broke in the Russian angrily, speaking in French, but with a readiness that showed he was able to follow English. "It's all a mistake for which you will pay heavily." "Ah, that's just what I wish to get at. There seems to be a little confusion. Perhaps I have been overzealous, but the fact is, Monsieur Bazard, you are wearing a false moustache, and that rather aroused my suspicions, see?" His hand did not seem to move, yet a second later the heavy moustache had been torn from the man's face. He started to his feet with an exclamation. Foyle waved him back to his chair. "I only wanted to feel sure that I was right. Now, monsieur, I want to make it clear that I have no right to ask you anything. If you wish to say anything, it will be taken down, and what action I take depends on what you say." Ivan scowled into the fire and preserved a stubborn silence. Whether he knew it or not, he held all the advantage. Unless he committed himself by some incautious word, there was little to implicate him in the murder. Suspicion there might be, but legal proof there was none. It would scarcely do to arrest him on such flimsy evidence. The Russian police had failed to trace his antecedents, and the Criminal Investigation Department were ignorant even of his surname. He had been known simply as Ivan at Grosvenor Gardens. Foyle tried again, and this time his voice was silky and soft as ever as he uttered a plainer threat. "I want to help you if I can. I don't want to have to charge you with the murder of Mr. Grell." The warm blood surged crimson to Ivan's face. In an instant he was out of his chair and had leapt at the throat of the detective. So rapid, so unexpected was the movement that although Heldon Foyle had not ceased his careful watchfulness, and although he writhed quickly aside, he was borne back by his assailant. The two crashed heavily to the floor. As they rolled over, struggling desperately, the grip upon the detective's throat grew even tighter and tighter. Half a dozen men had rushed into the room at the noise of the struggle and strove vainly to tear the Russian from his hold, but he hung on with the tenacity of a mastiff. There was a ringing in Foyle's ear and a red blur before his eyes. With a superhuman effort, he got his elbow under the Russian's chin and pressed it back sharply. The grip relaxed ever so slightly, but it was enough. Instantly, Foyle had wrested himself free, and Ivan was pinioned to the floor by the others. "Handcuffs," said the superintendent sharply. Someone got a pair on the prisoner's wrists, and he was jerked none too gently to his feet. A couple of men still held him. At a word from Foyle, the others had gone about their business, with the exception of Norman. The superintendent flicked the dust from his clothes and picked something, which had fallen during the struggle, from the floor. "You admit you are Ivan, then?" he said quietly. The Russian showed his teeth in a beast-like snarl. "Yes, I am Ivan," he said. "Make what you can of that, but you cannot have me hanged for the murder of Mr. Grell, and you know why." "Because Mr. Grell is not dead," retorted the detective smoothly. "Yes, I know that." He counted the rough and tumble but little against the fact that the Russian had now admitted that he knew it was not Grell's body that had been found in the study. Here was a starting point, at least. "What I want now," he went on slowly, "is an explanation of how you came to have possession of these." He held up the thing he had picked from the floor. It was a case of blue Morocco leather, and as he opened it, a magnificent string of pearls showed startlingly white against a dark background. "These pearls were bought at Streeter's by Mr. Grell as a wedding present to Lady Eileen Meredith," he said. "How do they come in your possession?" "They were given to me by Mr. Grell," cried Ivan. The fierce passion that had made him attack Foyle on the hint of arrest seemed to have melted away. Heldon Foyle's mask of a face showed no sign of the incredulity he felt. He made no comment, but ran his hands swiftly through the Russian's pockets, piling money, keys, watch, and other articles in a little heap on the table. Beyond a single letter, there were no documents on the man. He scanned the missive quickly. It was an ordinary commonplace note from a jeweller in Paris, addressed to Ivan Abramovich. This he placed aside. "May as well have his fingerprints," he said, and one of the officers present pressed Ivan's hands on a piece of inky tin and then on a piece of paper. The superintendent glanced casually at the impression. "All right," he said. "Take those handcuffs off. You may go, Mr. Abramovich." The Russian stood motionless, as though not understanding. Foyle wheeled about as though the whole matter had been dismissed from his mind and caught Norman by the sleeve. "Drop everything," he said in a curt whisper. "Take a couple of men and don't let that man out of your sight for an instant. I'll have you relieved from the yard in an hour's time." "Aren't you going to charge him, sir?" asked the other in astonishment. "Not likely," said Foyle with a laugh. Chapter 12. Heldon Foyle walked thoughtfully back to Scotland Yard, satisfied that the shadowing of Ivan Abramovich was in competent hands. With the strong man's confidence in himself, he had no fears as to his decision to release the man. He was beginning to have a shadowy idea of the relation of pieces in his jigsaw puzzle. Ivan, he knew, ought to have been arrested if only for failing to give a satisfactory account of his possession of the pearl necklace. But the superintendent had, as he mentally phrased it, tied a string to him, and it would not be his fault if nothing resulted. It was well after midnight before he had finished his work at Scotland Yard. He had had a long interview with the Garden of Eden, in which promises were adroitly mingled with threats. In the result, the bunco steerer had promised to keep his eyes and ears alert for news of anyone resembling Goldenburg. There was a string of other callers who had been discreetly sorted out by the superintendent's diplomatic lieutenants. Finally, he pulled out the book which dealt with the case, and with the aid of a typist added several more chapters. With a sigh of relief, he at last sauntered out into the cool, fresh midnight air. 9 o'clock next morning saw him again in his office. Sir Hilary Thornton was his first caller. Foyle put aside his reports at his chief's opening question. "Yes, we've taken every human precaution to preserve secrecy," he replied. "Everyone who knows that it is not Grell's body in the house has been pledged to hold his tongue. I have managed to get the inquest put back for 3 days, so that there will be no evidence of identification till then. That gives us a chance. And I've made out a confidential report to be sent to the Foreign Office, so that Grell's government shan't get restive. Here are the latest reports, sir." The Assistant Commissioner bent over the sheaf of typewritten documents for a little, in complete absorption. As he came to the last sheet, he gave a start of surprise. "So you let this man Ivan go? Do you think that wise?" "I'm fishing," answered Foyle enigmatically. "I couldn't have better bait than Ivan. There are 3 men sticking to him like limpets now, and a couple are keeping an eye on Sir Ralph Fairfield. I think that will be all right. Do you remember the Myton Grange case? We knew there had been a murder, but couldn't do anything till we found the body. Dutful, the murderer, would have slid off to some place where there's no extradition, but for the fact that I had him arrested on a charge of being in the unlawful possession of a pickaxe handle. This affair is the converse of that. We can't afford to have Ivan under lock and key." Sir Hilary Thornton bit his lip and looked steadfastly at the scarlet geranium on the window-sill, as though in search of enlightenment. "I believe I see," he exclaimed after a pause. "Ivan must have been something more than a valet. He's a superior type of man, and the conclusion to be drawn if he knows that Grell is alive—" "Precisely," interrupted the superintendent. "Any result for the offer of a reward for Goldenburg?" A flicker of amusement dwelt in Heldon Foyle's blue eyes. "Yes, he has been seen by different people within an hour or 2 of each other in Glasgow, Southampton, Gloucester, Cherbourg, Plymouth and Cardiff. Our information on that point is not precisely helpful. Of course, we've got the local police making inquiries in each case, but I don't anticipate they will find out much. Still, it will keep him amused." The necessity of a conference broke up further conversation. Gathered in the building were some 30 or 40 departmental chiefs of the CID, the picked men of their profession. Most of them were divisional detective inspectors who were in charge of districts, and some few were men who had special duties. They were ranged about tables in a lofty room, its green distempered walls hung with stiff photographs of living and retired officials. Men of all types were there, from the spruce, smartly groomed detectives of the West End to the burly, ill-dressed detectives of the East. Between them they spoke every known language. Here was Penny, who had specialised in forgeries; Brown, who knew every trick of coiners; Mulby, the terror of racecourse sharps; Menzies, who had as keen a scent for the gambling hell as a hound for a fox; Poole, who was intimate with the ways of railway thieves and shoplifters. Not one but thoroughly understood his profession and knew where to look for his information. Foyle took the chair, and the buzz of conversation became general. It was a business conference of experts. Views were exchanged on concrete problems, the movements of well-known criminals discussed. Velvet-fingered Ned had disappeared from Islington and reappeared in Brixton. Tony Smith was due out of prison. Mike O'Brien had patched up the peace with Yid Foster, and when they got together... So the talk went on, and so every district learned what was taking place in other districts. The superintendent sat silent for a while listening. At last his smooth voice broke in. "The man Ivan, whose description was circulated, is not to be touched now. Tell your men to let him alone if they come across him." There was a deep chorus. "Very good, sir." And Foyle, with a nod of dismissal, left the room. He stopped to make an inquiry in the clerk's office, and passing along the corridor, unlocked a door and pressed a bell. In under half an hour, a big labourer, with corduroys tied about the knees, lurched unsteadily out of the Lost Property Office and passed into Whitehall. Rough, tousled hair, an unkempt moustache, and a day's growth of beard on the chin were details warranted to stand inspection. Heldon Foyle rarely used a disguise, but when he did, he was careful that nothing should get out of order. Hair and moustache were his own, dyed and brushed cunningly. Yet when he reeled against Green near the Albany, the inspector, who was an observant man, pushed him roughly aside with an anathema on his clumsiness. "Didn't hurt you, did it?" stormed the labourer aggressively. "Course I look where I'm going." Then in a lower tone, "I'm Foyle. I got your telephone message. Anything moving now?" "If you don't go away, I shall call a constable." Green had been quick to see his cue and spoke loudly. He went on rapidly. "He hasn't stirred out. A post office messenger has just gone in with a letter for him. I said I was expecting one and got a glimpse at it." "All right, old pal, don't get excited. You go home and tell the missus all about it," retorted the labourer. Green walked rapidly away, spoke a few words to a man who was standing on the other side of the road, deeply interested in a bookseller's window, and departed. The superintendent felt in his pockets and produced a couple of boxes of matches. A constable strolled up, dignified and stern. A swift word in an undertone sent him away with burning cheeks. In half an hour, Foyle had sold a box of matches, for which he received 6pence with profuse thanks and inward disgust. If he sold his second box and still hung about, his loitering without excuse might attract undesirable attention. The contingency, however, did not arise, for a minute or two later Fairfield himself strolled into the street. Foyle rushed to open the door of a taxicab, which he hailed, but another tout was before him. Nevertheless, he heard the address. "Grave Street, Whitechapel," he murmured to himself as the cab slipped away. "Ivan has got to work." A short argument with a second cab driver, who distrusted his appearance, was cut short by a deposit of 5 shillings as a guarantee of good faith, and the superintendent also began the journey. Behind him, a third cab carried the man who had been so deeply interested in the bookseller's window. Chapter 13. Grave Street, Whitechapel, is not a savoury neighbourhood. One may pass from end to end of its squalid length and hear scarce a word of English. Yiddish is the language most favoured by its cosmopolitan population, although one may hear now and again Polish, Russian or German. In its barrack-like houses, rising sheer from the pavement, a chain of tenancy obtains, ranging from the actual householder to the tenant of half a room, who sublets corners of the meagre space on terms payable strictly in advance. A score of people will herd together in a room a few feet square and never realise that they are cramped for space. Here you will find petty thieves, versatile rascals ripe for any mischief, and sweated factory workers. Here, sallow-faced anarchists boldly denounce the existing order of things to their fellows and scheme the millennium. Slatternly women quarrel at the doors, and horseflesh is a staple article of diet. The neatly dressed Fairfield, descending at the end of the street from his taxicab, was as conspicuous among the unshaven idlers who hung about the pavements as the moon among the stars. Sir Ralph picked his way towards a newspaper shop, his mind full of the message that had brought him to the spot. The letter delivered by the messenger had contained but a few words in printed characters. If you would learn the truth about the murder in Grosvenor Gardens, come immediately to number Grave Street. There was no signature, no clue to the identity of the writer. Fairfield had leapt at the chance to do something. Even if it were a hoax, it would occupy his mind for a time and take his thoughts away from the sinister shadow that overhung him. Somehow, however, he did not think it was a hoax. The newspaper shop displayed the number given in the note on its grimy fascia. The baronet, as he moved towards it, was unconscious of the slouching figure of the labourer who had been selling matches near the Albany a few paces behind him. His foot was on the threshold of the shop when a man, black-bearded and swarthy, pressed an envelope into his hand. Foyle watched the incident and his pace quickened. Before Fairfield had time to do more than glance at the inscription of the envelope, he was abreast. He lurched inward and his fingers snatched quickly at the note. The next instant he was running with long, even strides for the open of the main road. It was barefaced robbery, of course, but he had not the inclination to stick at trifles. That the note had some bearing on the case he was investigating, he felt certain. There was only one way to get it at once, and that was to steal. Anywhere else but in Grave Street he would have waited to face the matter out. Not that Grave Street would have frowned upon a theft, but that he would have been forced to reveal his identity, and Grave Street was not a healthy neighbourhood for solitary detectives. Sir Ralph stood, thunderstruck, but someone else acted. The black-bearded man had disappeared. From somewhere there were a couple of dull thuds like a hammer falling upon wood, and Foyle heard the whistle of bullets over his head. "I'll get even for that," he muttered between his teeth, but his headlong flight never slackened. Behind him was a clatter of pursuing feet. Fairfield, recovering himself, had raised a cry, and it was taken up. "Stop, thief! Hold him!" He passed the man who had been so eagerly intent on the bookshop. The man made a clutch at him, missed, and fell headlong right in the path of Fairfield, now a few paces behind. The baronet tripped over his body and was thrown violently to the ground. Foyle made a mental note in favour of Detective Sergeant Chambers, who had so adroitly intercepted the pursuit. As he came to the main road he slackened his pace to a sharp walk and dived into an underground station. He breathed a sigh of relief as he passed down the steps to the platform. He had anticipated trouble, but pistol shots in broad daylight, even in Grave Street, had been outside his calculations. He had recognised the peculiar report of an automatic pistol. His adversaries, whoever they might be, were obviously very much in earnest. Pistol shooting at detectives is not a commonplace pastime, even with the most reckless of criminals. Foyle decided on another and early visit to Grave Street, and promised himself grimly that the target should be someone else if it came to shooting again. He was in danger of losing his temper. Not until he had got in the train did he open the note that was still between his fingers. He frowned as he read it. "Curse it! This comes of acting on impulse. Why couldn't I have waited? I had the whole thing in my hands." The note said simply, "I am alive. I must see you. Follow the man who gives you this note. R.G." Heldon Foyle had seen much of Robert Grell's writing during his search of the house in Grosvenor Gardens, and had no doubt that the note was his. His peace of mind was not increased by the reflection that had he waited and continued to shadow Fairfield, he might have discovered the whereabouts of the missing diplomat. Now he had merely given notice as plainly as though he had shouted from the housetops that Fairfield was under observation. He had committed a blunder, and he did not forgive blunders easily, especially in himself. Even a bath and a change into his normal clothing did not restore his equanimity. In his office he found Green with a strange excitement in his usually stolid face. "Hello, Mr. Green, what's wrong?" he demanded. The veteran chief detective inspector pulled at his moustache. "I don't know, sir, yet. You've come just in time. Waverley is missing." "Waverley missing? That's nonsense. He was put on to relieve Norman in shadowing Ivan Abramovich." "He's missing," repeated the other doggedly. "Ivan went into a shop with an entrance in 2 streets, and the man who was assisting Waverley slipped round to the other side. He waited there an hour, and then went to look for Waverley." The superintendent gave a short, contemptuous laugh. "Green, I guess you've been working too hard lately. You ought to apply for a fortnight's leave. Can't you see, Ivan came out and that Waverley never had time to give the tip to his man, but followed him straight away. There ought to have been 3 men on the job." Green drew himself up stiffly. Foyle had not recovered from the irritation caused by his own mistake, otherwise he would not have spoken as he did. Green was not the kind of man to hastily jump to conclusions. "A third was not available when Waverley left," he said. "Here is why I say Waverley is missing. It came by messenger 5 minutes ago, addressed to you. As senior officer, I opened it." Foyle took a typewritten sheet of paper from the other's hand. It read simply, "Dear Mr. Foyle, you had better call your men off. We have got one of them safe and hold him as a hostage for our own safety. If your people go on trying to make things unpleasant for us, things will get unpleasant for him. This is not melodrama, but brutal fact." There was no signature. Foyle's square jaw became set and grim. He had no doubt that the unknown writer fully meant the threat. He liked Waverley, yet the thought of the other's peril did not sway him for a moment. The man had fallen a victim to one of the risks of his profession. "Do they expect us to back down?" asked the superintendent harshly. "If Waverley has been fool enough to get himself in a fix, he must take his chance if we can't get him out. Let's have a look at this paper." He thrust his hand in a drawer and, flinging a pinch of black powder on the letter, sifted it gingerly to and fro. In a few seconds 4 fingerprints stared out blackly from the white surface. They were at right angles to the type and just beneath it. Foyle's face relaxed in a pleased smile. "They've given us something that may help us after all, Green," he cried. "Look here. These 2 middle ones are the prints on the dagger. Now let's see if we can learn anything from the typing." Half an hour later 3 men stood in a tiny room, darkened save for a vivid patch of white on a screen 1.5 yards square. Foyle and Green watched the screen intently as the 3rd man inserted the slide in the powerful magic lantern. Magnified enormously, the typewritten characters stood out vividly black against the white. "What do you make of it, Green?" asked the superintendent after a pause. "Remington machine, latest pattern," answered the other briefly. "The letter B slightly battered and the O out of alignment, used by a beginner. There is double spacing between some of the lines and single in others. A capital W has been superimposed on a small one." "That's so," agreed his superior thoughtfully. "You might see if the Remington people can give us any help with that. If possible, get a list of all the people who have bought machines during this last 6 weeks. It's a long shot, but long shots sometimes come off. And if you come into my room, I'll give you a pistol. It'll be as well for you to carry one while you're on this case. I was shot at myself today." "Thank you, sir. I think I'll do without one," said the other quietly. "My 2 fists are good enough for me." "As you like," agreed Foyle, and Green departed on his mission. When he returned, he walked into Foyle's room and laid a long list before his chief. The superintendent cast his forefinger slowly down it. "October 14th, he read. "Mr. John Smith, care of Israel's, 404A, Grave Street, Whitechapel." He looked up into the stolid face of Green. "That seems like it," he went on. "You and I will take a little trip this evening, Green, and I think you'd better have a pistol after all." Chapter 14. To all callers, relatives, friends, newspaper men alike, Eileen Meredith denied herself resolutely. "She has been rendered completely prostrate by the shock," said the Daily Wire in the course of a highly coloured character sketch. Other statements, more or less true, with double and treble column photographs of herself, crept into other papers. Night and day a little cluster of journalists hung about, watching the front door, scanning every caller, and questioning them when they were turned away. Now and again one would go to the door and make a hopeless attempt to see some member of the household. But Eileen was not prostrate, in spite of the Daily Wire. She wanted to be alone with her thoughts. Her gay vivacity had deserted her, and she had become a sombre woman, with mouth set in rigid lines and with a fierce intensity for vengeance, none the less implacable because she felt her impotence. In such unreasoning moods, some women become dangerous. She had curtly rejected her father's suggestion that she should see a doctor, nor would she leave London to try and forget amid fresh surroundings. "Here I will stay until Bob's murderer is punished," she had said, and her white teeth had come together viciously. A night and a day had passed since her interview with Heldon Foyle. Reflection had not convinced her that his cold reason was right. She had made up her mind that Fairfield was the murderer. Nothing could shake her from that conviction. Scotland Yard, she thought, was afraid of him because he was a man of position. The square-faced superintendent who had spoken so smoothly was probably trying to shield him. But she knew. She was certain. Suppose she told all she knew? Her slim hands clenched till the nails cut her flesh as she determined that he should pay the price of his crime. There was another justice than the law. If the law failed her... A medical man or a student of psychology might have found an analysis of her feelings interesting. She had reached the borderline of monomania, yet he would have been a daring man who would have called her absolutely insane. Except to Foyle, she had said nothing of the feeling that obsessed her. With cool deliberation, she unlocked a drawer of her escritoire and picked out a dainty little ivory-butted revolver with polished barrel. It was very small, almost a toy. She broke it apart and pushed 5 cartridges into the chambers. With a furtive glance over her shoulder, she placed it in her bosom and then hastily returned to her chair by the fire and picked up a book. Her eyes skimmed the lines of type mechanically. She read nothing, although she turned the pages. Presently she flung the book aside and, without ringing for a maid, dressed in an unobtrusive walking costume of deep black. She selected a heavy fur muff and transferred the pistol to its interior. Her fingers closed tightly over the butt. On her way to the door she was stopped by an apologetic footman. "There's a lot of persons from the newspapers waiting out in the streets, Lady Eileen," he said. "Indeed." Her voice was cold and hard. "They might annoy you. They stop everyone who goes in or out." She answered shortly and stepped out through the door he held open. There was a quick stir among the reporters, and 2 of them hastily detached themselves and confronted her, hats in hand. She forced a smile. "It's no use, gentlemen," she said. "I will not be interviewed." She looked very dainty and pathetic as she spread out her hands in a helpless little gesture. "Can I not appeal to your chivalry? You are besieging a house of mourning. And please, please, I know what is in your minds. Do not follow me." She had struck the right note. There was no attempt to break her down. With apologies, the men withdrew. After all, they were gentlemen whose intrusion on a private grief was personally repugnant to them. The girl reached Scotland Yard while Heldon Foyle was still in talk with Green. Her name at once procured her admission to him. She took no heed of the chair he offered, but remained standing, her serious grey eyes searching his face. He observed the high colour on her cheeks and almost intuitively guessed that she was labouring under some impulse. "Please do sit down," he pleaded. "You want to know how the case is progressing. I think we shall have some news for you by tomorrow. I hope it will be good." "You are about to make an arrest?" The words came from her like a pistol shot. A light shot into her eyes. The detective shook his head. He had seen the look in her face once before on the face of a woman. That was at Las Palmas, in a dancing hall, when a Portuguese girl had knifed a fickle lover with a dagger drawn from her stocking. Lady Eileen was scarce likely to carry a dagger in her stocking, but his gaze lingered for a second on the muff, which she had not put aside. It was queer that she should not withdraw her hands. "I don't say that. It depends on circumstances," he said gently. Her face clouded. "I will swear that the man Fairfield killed him," she cried passionately. "You will let him get away, you and your red tape." He came and stood by her. "Listen to me, Lady Eileen," he said earnestly. "Sir Ralph Fairfield did not kill Mr. Grell. Of that I have proof. Will you not trust us and wait a little? You are doing Sir Ralph a great injustice by your suspicions." She laughed wildly and flung herself away from him. "You talk to me as though I were a schoolgirl," she retorted. "You can't throw dust in my eyes, Mr. Foyle. He has bought you. You are going to let him go. I know, but he shall not escape." The superintendent stroked his chin placidly. As if by accident he had placed himself between her and the door. He had already made up his mind what to do, but the situation demanded delicate handling. "You will regret this when you are calmer," he said mildly. He was uncertain in his mind whether to tell the distraught girl that her lover was not dead, that the murdered man was a rogue whom probably she had not seen or heard of in her life. He balanced the arguments mentally, pro and con, and decided that at all hazards he would preserve his secret for the present. She took a step towards the door. She had drawn herself up haughtily. "Let me pass, please," she demanded. He did not move. "Where are you going?" he asked. Her eyes met his steadily.
"I am going to Sir Ralph Fairfield to wring a confession from him, if you must know," she said. "Let me pass, please." "I will let you pass after you have given me the pistol you are carrying in your muff," he retorted, holding out his hand. Then the tigress broke loose in the delicately brought up, gently nurtured girl. She withdrew her right hand from her muff, and Foyle struck quickly at her wrist. The pistol clattered to the floor, and the man closed with her. It needed all his tremendous physical strength to lift her bodily by the waist and place her, screaming and striking wildly at his face with her clenched fists, in a chair. He held her there with one hand and lifted one of the half-dozen speaking tubes behind his desk with the other. In 10 minutes, Lady Eileen Meredith, in charge of a doctor and a motherly-looking matron hastily summoned from the adjoining police station in Cannon Row, was being taken back to her home in a state of semi-stupor. Foyle picked up the dainty little revolver from the floor and, jerking the cartridges out, placed it on the mantelpiece. "You can never tell what a woman will do," he said to himself. "All the same, I think I have saved Ralph Fairfield's life today." Chapter 15. Heldon Foyle was more deeply chagrined than he would have cared to admit by the disappearance of Waverley. It was not only that one of the most experienced men of the Criminal Investigation Department had fallen into a trap and so placed his colleagues in difficulties. The very audacity of the coup showed that the department was matched against no ordinary opponents. There is a limit even to the daring of the greatest professional criminals. If there were professionals acting in this business, reflected the superintendent, the idea was none of theirs. Besides, no professional would have written the letter threatening the Yard. That was no bluff. The fingerprints proved that. To hold a Scotland Yard man as a hostage was a game only to be played by those who had much at stake. Only one man shared Heldon Foyle's confidence. That was Sir Hilary Thornton. To the Assistant Commissioner he talked freely. "It's an ugly job for us, sir. There's no disguising that. Naturally, they count on us keeping our mouths shut about Waverley. It's lucky he's not a married man. If the story of the way he was bagged becomes public property, we shall be a laughing-stock, even if we get him out of his trouble. And if we don't, the scandal will be something worse." "Yes, it's bad, bad," agreed the Assistant Commissioner. "The press must not hear of this." "Trust me," said Foyle grimly, "the press won't." "I don't like this affair of Lady Eileen Meredith," went on Sir Hilary. "After all, she has a good right to know the truth. Wouldn't it be better to let her know that Grell is alive?" Foyle jingled some money in his trousers pocket. "I hate it as much as you do, Sir Hilary. I can't take any chances, though. Grell knows we know he is alive. When he finds that this girl has not been told, he may try to communicate with her, and then we may be able to lay hands on him and Ivan, and so clear up the mystery. There's another thing. As far as our inquiries through his solicitors and the bank go, he couldn't have had much ready cash on him. He'll try to get some sooner or later, probably through his friends. He's already tried to approach Fairfield." "I see," agreed the other in the tone of a man not quite convinced. "Now when are you going down to Grave Street again? You'll want at least a dozen men." "There won't be any trouble at Grave Street," answered Foyle with a smile, "and if there is, Green and I will have to settle it. More men would only be in the way. Our first job is to get hold of Waverley." "But only 2 of you? Grave Street isn't exactly a nice place. If there is trouble—" "We'll risk that, sir," said Foyle, stiffening a trifle. He went back to his own room and signed a few letters. Some words through a speaking tube brought Green in, stolid, gloomy, imperturbable. The Chief Inspector accepted and lit a cigar. Through a cloud of smoke the 2 men talked for a while. They were going on a mission that might very easily result in death. No one would have guessed it from their talk, which, after half an hour of quiet, business-like conversation, drifted into desultory gossip and reminiscences. "Sir Hilary wanted me to take a dozen men," said Foyle. "I told him the 2 of us would be plenty." "Quite enough, if we're to do anything," agreed Green. "I wouldn't be out of it for 1,000. Poor old Waverley and I have put in a lot of time together. I guess I owe him my life if it comes to that." Foyle interjected a question. The Chief Inspector lifted his cigar tenderly from his lips. "It was in the old garrotting days," he said. "Waverley and I were coming down the Tottenham Court Road a bit after midnight, just off 7 Dials. There were half a dozen men hanging about a corner, and one of them tiptoed after us with a pitch plaster. You'll remember they used to do the stuff up in sacking and pull it over your mouth from behind. I never noticed anything, but Waverley did. The man was just about to throw the thing over me when Waverley wheeled round and hit him clean across the face with the light cane he was carrying. The chap was knocked in the gutter, and his pals came at us with a rush. A hansom driver shouted to us to leave the man in the roadway to him, and hanged if he didn't drive clean over him with the near side wheel. That gave us our chance. We hopped into the cab and got away without staying to see if anyone was hurt. But if Waverley hadn't hit out when he did, I'd have been a goner." "I had a funny thing happen to me once in the Tottenham Court Road," said Foyle reminiscently. "I was an inspector then, and Big Bill Sladen was working with me. He had a beautiful tenor voice, you will remember. We were after a couple of confidence men and had a man we were towing about to identify them. Well, we got 'em down to a saloon bar near the Oxford Street end, but I daren't go in because they knew me. It was a bitter cold night with a cold wind and snow and sleet, so I stayed on the opposite side of the road and induced Bill to go over and sing 'I Am But a Poor Blind Boy' in the hope that our birds would call him in and give him a drink. He hadn't been at it 5 minutes before a fiery, red-headed little potman had knocked him head over heels in the gutter and told him to go away. Bill could have broken the chap in two with his little finger, but he didn't do anything. He came over to me and I sent him back again. This time he did get invited inside, and there he stayed for a full hour, while the witness and I stood shivering and wet and miserable in the snow. We could hear him laughing and singing with the best of 'em. They wouldn't let him come away. It was not until I took all risks and marched in with the witness and arrested them that they tumbled to the fact that he wasn't a real street singer." He glanced at his watch. "You'd better go and have a rest, Green. Meet me here at 12:30. We'll take a taxi to Aldgate and walk up from there. And by the way, here's a pistol. I needn't tell you not to use it unless you've got to."
Chapter 16. A bitter wind was sweeping the commercial road, Whitechapel, as the two detectives, each well muffled up, descended from their cab and walked briskly eastwards. Save for a slouching wayfarer or two, shambling unsteadily along, and little groups gathered about the all-night coffee stalls, the roads were deserted. Neither man had attempted any disguise. It was not necessary now. As they turned into Grave Street, they automatically walked in the centre of the roadway. There were some places where it is not healthy to walk at night on shadowed pavements. They moved without haste and without loitering, as men who know exactly what they have to do. From one of the darkened houses a woman's shrill scream issued, full of rage and terror. It was followed by a man's loud, angry tones, the thud of blows, shrieks, curses, and brutal laughter. Then the silence dropped over everything again. The two men had apparently paid no heed. Even had they been inclined to play the part of knights-errant in what was not an uncommon episode in Grave Street, they knew that the woman who had been chastised would probably have been the first to turn on them. There was a side entrance to 404A, which was the newspaper shop that Foyle had cause to remember. He struck the grimy panel sharply with his fist and waited. There was no reply. Again he knocked, and Green, unbuttoning his greatcoat, flung it off and laid it across his arm. He could drop it easily in case of an emergency. Still there was no answer to the knock. "Luckily I swore out a search warrant," muttered Foyle, and searched in his own pockets for something. It was a jemmy of finely tempered steel, gracefully curved at one end. He inserted it in a crevice of the door and, leaning his weight upon it, obtained an irresistible leverage. There was a slight crack and it swung inwards as the screws of the hasp drew. The two men stepped within and, closing the door, stood absolutely still for a matter of 10 minutes. Not a sound betrayed that their burglarious entry had alarmed anyone. Presently Green made a movement, and a vivid shaft of light from a pocket electric lamp played along the narrow uncarpeted passage. The superintendent gripped his jemmy tightly and turned towards the dirty stairs. Then the light vanished as quickly as it had flared up, and from above there came a sound of shuffling footsteps. Even Heldon Foyle, whom no one would have accused of nervousness, felt his heart beat a trifle more quickly. He knew that if he were as near the heart of the mystery as he believed, any second might see shooting. Penned as he and his companion were in the narrow space of the passage barely 3 feet wide, a shot fired from above could scarcely miss. Crouching low, he sprang up the narrow staircase in 3 bounds, making scarcely a sound. On the landing above, he wound his arms tightly about the person whose movements he had heard, and whispered a quick, tense command. "Not a word, or it will be the worse for you. Let's have a light, Green." The prisoner kept very still, and Green flashed a light on his face. It was that of a man of 40 or so, with pronounced Hebrew features. His greasy black hair was tangled in coarse curls, and a smooth black moustache ran across his upper lip. A pair of shifty eyes were fixed fearfully on Foyle, and the man murmured something in a guttural tongue. "We are police officers. How many people are there in this house?" demanded Foyle sternly, in a low voice. "You may as well answer in English. Quietly now." He had released his hold around the Jew's waist, but stood with the jimmy dangling by his side and with ears cocked ready for any sound. Green had climbed the stairs and stood by his side. Domiciliary visits are unfrequent in England, but the Jew was not certain enough to stand upon a legal technicality. As a matter of fact, the search warrant would have met the difficulty. He cringed before the two men, whose faces he could not see, for Green had thrown his wedge of light so that it showed up the man's sallow face and left all else in darkness. "I do not know why you have come," he answered, forming each word precisely. "I have done nothing wrong. I am an honest newsagent. There is only my wife, daughter, son, lodger in house." "You are a receiver of stolen goods," answered Foyle, something, it must be confessed, at a venture. "Don't trouble to deny it, Mr. Israels. We're not after you this time, not if you treat us fairly. What about this lodger of yours? Have you bought him a typewriter lately?" Yes, I help you all I can," protested the Jew, with an eagerness that deceived neither of the detectives. There is no class of liar so abysmal as the East End criminal Jew. They will hold to a glib falsehood with a temerity that nothing can shake. If there is no necessity to lie, they lie for practice, it is to be presumed. The best way to extract a truth is to make a direct assertion by the light of apparent knowledge, and so sometimes obtain assent. Foyle knew the idiosyncrasies of the breed, hence the threat in his demand. "I bought a typewriter, yes," went on Israels. "I think he was honest. Didn't seem as though police after him." "Which room is he in?" Israels jerked a thumb upwards. "Next landing, door on left," he ejaculated nervously. The superintendent pushed by the man. He knew that the critical moment had come. With his quick judgment of men, he had summed up Mr. Israels. Whatever the Jew's morals, it was evident that he had a wholesome respect for his own oily skin. He would not risk himself to save the neck of another man. Foyle's intentions were simple. He would steal quietly up the second flight of stairs, burst the door open if it were locked, and seize the man he was in search of in his sleep. But his plans were frustrated. He had not taken 2 steps when a woman peeped from an adjoining room. He caught one glimpse of her in the semi-darkness with a police whistle at her lips. He sprang forward, and as he did so, a shrill, ear-piercing blast rang out. Green was close behind him. She shrieked as the detective tore the whistle from her, and he felt her slender figure entwine itself about him. Down he went with his companion on top of him, and another woman's loud, hysterical cries added to the pandemonium. Foyle picked himself up and, lifting the girl bodily, flung her without ceremony into the room from which she had emerged. From above a voice shouted something, and a knife whizzed downstairs and struck quivering in the bare boards of the landing, grazing Green's shoulders. All need for caution was gone now. Foyle had dropped his jemmy, and his hand closed over his pistol. Only as a last resource would he use it, but if he had to, well, there could be no harm in having it handy. A door slammed as the 2 detectives climbed the second flight of stairs. Green flung himself against the one that had been indicated by Israels, and the flimsy fastening gave way under the shock of his 13 stone. There was no one in the room. Savagely, Heldon Foyle turned and caught the handle of a second door. It turned, and they entered the room, empty like the first, but with an open window looking out on a series of low roofs a dozen feet below. And over the roofs a shadowy figure of a man was clambering hurriedly. He could only dimly be seen. Green clambered through onto the window-sill and dropped. He was unlucky. A projecting piece of wood caught his foot, and he staggered and lost time. Before he had recovered himself, the fugitive was out of sight, and the sound of his progress had ceased. Foyle called to him to come back, and without waiting to see whether his orders were obeyed, made his way back again to the first-floor landing. Israels was still there, very white and shaky, as the superintendent struck a match. "Where's that girl?" said the detective curtly, "the one who gave the alarm." "My daughter. She thought you were burglars. She didn't know." "Where is she?" Without waiting for a reply, he entered the room whence she had emerged, and striking another match, applied it to a gas bracket. A fat woman was sitting up in bed looking at him timorously. He paid no heed to her, but stooped to look under the bed. When he straightened himself, Green had rejoined him. "The girl gave us away," exclaimed Foyle. "Here, you, where is she gone?" He shook the woman roughly by the shoulder. "Go to the bottom of the stairs, Green, and see that no one slips in or out. Take that chap outside down with you." "My daughter!" exclaimed the woman helplessly. "She has gone to stay with her aunt. We are respectable people. You frightened her. We don't like the police coming here." "Highly respectable," repeated Foyle under his breath. Aloud, he said menacingly, "We shall soon know whether you are respectable. Where does the girl's aunt live?" 22 Shadwell Lane, was the reply, glib and prompt. Foyle looked for an instant penetratingly at her. Her eyes dropped. His hand went to his pocket, and he calmly lit a cigar. Then he went downstairs to where Green was on guard and politely apologized to Israels. Casually, he repeated the question he had put to the woman. Yes, the Jew had seen his daughter go out. She said she was going to her aunt. Her aunt lived at 48 Sussex Street. "I see," said the superintendent quietly. "The fact is, of course, that she is not your daughter, and that she has not gone to her aunt's. You are in an awkward corner, my man," he went on, changing his tone and moving a step nearer. "Better tell us the truth. Your wife has let me know something." As if mechanically, he was dangling a pair of shiny steel handcuffs in his fingers. Handcuffs seldom formed a part of his equipment, but tonight he had carried them with him on the off chance that he might have to use them. The Jew shrank away, but the sight had proved effective. "I'll tell all the truth," he whined, with an outspreading gesture of his hands. "I've done no wrong. You can't hurt me. She came here a day or two ago and paid £5 for a week's lodging. I was to tell anyone who inquired that she was my daughter. She slept with my wife. What harm was there? I am poor." £5 isn't picked up like that every day. The man came afterwards. He said he was a journalist and asked me to buy him a typewriting machine. I asked no questions. Why should I?" His manner was that of a much injured man. Foyle cut him short now and again as he rambled on with a question. In half an hour he felt that he had extracted a fair amount of truth, mingled though it was with cunning lies. He guessed now that the woman whom he had vaguely seen was she whose part in the mystery of the house in Grosvenor Gardens had always been shadowy and vague. She could be none other than Lola Rochelle, little Lola of Vienna, otherwise the Princess Petrovska. Chapter 17. There was nothing more to be done at Grave Street. Heldon Foyle remained in the house while Green walked to the chief divisional station, and in an hour or two the divisional inspector with a couple of men arrived. Then Foyle saw to a strict search of the house from top to bottom. Nothing there was that seemed to possess any great importance as bearing on the case. The man who had fled over the roof had used a single room, apparently as bed and sitting room, so it was to this place that the detectives devoted chief attention. "He must have been sleeping in his clothes," grumbled Green. "He hadn't time to dress. There's the typewriter the note was written on." He sat down before a rickety table and, inserting a piece of paper in the machine, slowly tapped out the alphabet, and after a brief inspection passed the paper on to the superintendent, who scanned it casually and was about to throw it away when something gripped his attention. "This looks queer," he muttered, and held the paper up slantingly away from the gas jet in order to examine it by what photographers call transmitted light. His brows were drawn together tightly. The sheet of paper which Green had used was an ordinary piece of writing paper. On its rough surface Foyle had noted a slight sheen, unusual enough to attract his attention. Even he would not have noticed it but for the angle in which he had happened first to look at it when he took it from Green. It might be an accidental fault in the manufacture of the paper, yet trivial as it seemed, it was unusual, and one of the chief assets in detective work is not to let the unusual go unexplained. "It's the same typewriter, there can be no question of that," said Green. "You can see that the B is knocked about and the O is out of line." "That's all right," said Foyle. "I wasn't thinking of that. It looks to me as if there's some sympathetic writing on this." He held the paper so that the heat from the gas jet warmed it. Every moment he expected that the heat would bring something to light on the paper. He gave a petulant exclamation as nothing happened, and his eyes roved over the table whence Green had taken the paper. He believed that he was not mistaken, that there was something written which could be brought to light if he knew how. He knew that there were chemicals that could be used for secret communications which could only be revealed by the use of other chemicals, a process something akin to development in photography. It was unlikely, if the user of the room had used some chemical agent, that he would have thought of destroying and concealing it. But there was nothing on the table that suggested itself to Foyle as having been used in the connection. Keenly he scrutinised the room, his well-manicured hand caressing his chin. "Ah!" he exclaimed at last. He had noted a small bottle of gum arabic standing on the cast-iron mantelpiece. Now, gum arabic can be used for a variety of purposes, and it has the merit of invisible ink of being made decipherable by quite a simple process which minimises the risk of accidental disclosure. The superintendent held the paper to the gas again for a few minutes. Then, from a corner of the room, he collected a handful of dust, no difficult process, for it was long since the place had felt the purifying influence of a broom, and rubbed it hard on the rough surface of the paper. A jumble of letters stood out greyly on the surface. He looked at them hard, and Green, peeping over his shoulder, frowned. "Cipher!" he exclaimed. It was undoubtedly cipher, but whether a simple or abstruse one, Foyle was in no position to judge. He had an elementary knowledge of the subject, but he had no intention of attempting to solve it by himself. There were always experts to whom appeal could be made. A successful detective, like a successful journalist, is a man who knows the value of specialists, who knows where to go for the information he wants. That meaningless jumble of letters could only be juggled into sense by an expert. Foyle nevertheless scrutinised them closely, more as a matter of habit than of reading anything from them. They were UJQW, stop. BJNT, stop. FJ, stop. UJM, stop. FJTV, stop. UIYIQL, stop. SK, stop. DQU, QZO, KKEY, JPK, stop. ANUJ, stop. M, stop. Q, stop. NG, stop. N, stop. AYUQNQIX, stop. IGZ, stop. ANUJ, stop. SIO, stop. IGZ, stop. SMPPN, stop. RT, stop. 12845 space HGZ VFSF, stop. "We'll let Jones have a go at that," he said. "Anything else now?" Someone handed him the knife that had been thrown at him on the landing and a curious leather sheath that had been picked up near the bed. From the bottom of the sheath depended a leather tassel. Foyle looked it over and failed to discover any manufacturer's name. He slipped the weapon into his pocket with the mental reflection that it looked Greek. The search went on from attic to cellar, and profuse notes were taken of everything found with its exact position. The elaborate trouble taken by these men to describe minutely in writing every little thing would have seemed absurd to anyone not versed in the ways of the Criminal Investigation Department. Yet nothing was done that was not necessary. An error of an inch in a measurement might make all the difference when the case came on for trial. Foyle and Green left the house in charge of the divisional man. Already a description had been circulated of the man they had failed to surprise, but as neither had caught more than a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the darkness, they had had to rely on the descriptions given by Israels and his wife. And even if that estimable pair had really tried honestly to give a fair description of the man, which the detectives thought was extremely doubtful, there could be little hope that it was accurate. If the average man tries to describe the appearance of his most intimate friend and then asks a stranger to identify him, he will realize how misleading such descriptions may be even at the best of times. Yet the Criminal Investigation Department had to work with such material as they had. Heldon Foyle was very silent as they trudged side by side out of Whitechapel into the silent city streets, for there are no taxicabs to be found in the East End at such hours. The case was developing, but though he was beginning to have a hazy glimpse into some of its workings, there was much that remained a mystery to him. His questionings of Israels had satisfied him that the man who had escaped was neither Grell nor Ivan. He could not blame himself for not effecting an arrest. Looking back over the night's events, he could not see that he could have taken further precaution. If he had taken more men, the escape would have occurred just the same over the roofs, for he would still have felt it his duty to question Israels. He could not have foreseen that the ready-witted Lola was there, nor that she should have so ingeniously given the alarm. The luck had been against him. Nevertheless, he had gained an important fact. Lola was in London, and was obviously acting in concert with Grell. It was easier to look for two persons than one. Sooner or later he would lay hands on them and solve the mystery of the murder. He clenched his fists resolutely as his thoughts carried him away. Meanwhile, there was the cipher. If that could be decoded, it might be valuable. Green's voice broke in upon his thoughts. "We didn't find anything bearing on Waverley." "Waverley?" repeated Foyle. "Oh, yes, I had almost forgotten him." For an hour after they had reached Scotland Yard, the superintendent laboured at his desk, collecting reports and writing fresh chapters in the book which held all the facts in relation to the crime, so far as he knew them. He slipped the result of his labours at last in an envelope and left them over to be dealt with by the inspector in charge of the registry, which is a department that serves as official memory to Scotland Yard. "That is all right," he said, and stretched himself. Someone knocked at the door. The handle turned, and an erect man with his right arm carried in a black silk handkerchief, improvised into a sling, entered the room. It was Detective Inspector Waverley. Chapter 18. Heldon Foyle was on his feet in a second, and he pushed a chair towards his subordinate. Detective Inspector Waverley sat down and drummed nervously on his knees with the fingers of his left hand. "Well, you've got back," said the superintendent in a non-committal tone. "We were beginning to wonder what had happened to you. I hope that arm of yours is not badly hurt. What has been the trouble?" The inspector winced and sat bolt upright in his chair. "I guess I was to blame, sir," he said. "I fell into a trap like a new-joined cabbage boy. This man, Ivan Abramovitch, must have known that he was followed by a couple of us, so he threw off Taylor, who was with me, very simply, by going into a big outfitter's place in the city. I dodged round to a second entrance, and sure enough, he came out there. I couldn't get word to Taylor, so I picked him up, and a pretty dance he led me through a maze of alleys up the side of Petticoat Lane and round about by the Whitechapel Road. You all know the sort of neighbourhood it is there. Well, I suppose I must have got a bit careless, for in taking a narrow twist in one of those alleys, someone dropped on me from behind. I hit out and yelled, but I didn't get a second chance, for my head was bumped hard down on the pavement, and I went to sleep for good and plenty. There were a couple of men in it, for I could hear 'em talking before I became properly unconscious. They dragged me along, linking their arms in mine, and we got into a cab. I guess the driver thought I was drunk, and that they were my pals helping me home. When I came round, my head was bandaged up, and I was in quite a decent little room, lying on a couch with Mr. Ivan Abramovitch sitting opposite to me. I couldn't give a guess where it was, for the window only looked out on a blank wall. I sat up, and he grinned at me. "I am a police officer," I said. "How did I get here?" "I brought you," he says with a grin. "You were taking too great an interest in my doings for my liking. Now I am going to take an interest in yours." At that I jumped for him and got a knife through my arm for my pains. After he'd sworn at me like a trooper in English, French and Russian for about 10 minutes, he bandaged up the cut with his handkerchief and told me if I made any more fuss I was in for trouble. Someone knocked at the door, but he ordered them off. "You won't get away from here alive without permission if I can help it," he said. "But if you do, you won't be able to identify anyone but myself. If you take it coolly, there'll be no harm come to you." I tried to bluff a bit, but he just laughed, and then I stayed with him in the same room up to within an hour or two ago, when someone came into the house and he was summoned outside the door. They had an excited powwow, and I could hear a woman talking. Finally, the man came back and told me they'd determined to let me go. He put a handkerchief over my eyes, and after a while I was taken down into what I thought was a taxicab. I was turned out a quarter of an hour ago at the Blackfriars end of the embankment." Foyle was by now striding up and down the office, his hands thrust deep in his trousers pockets. He paused long enough to blow down a speaking tube and put a quick question. What was the number of the cab? It had no police number. Its index mark was AA4796. The superintendent drew from his pocket a little black book, such as is carried by every police officer in London. On the outside was inscribed in white letters, "Metropolitan Police Pocket Directory." He turned over the pages until he found what he wanted. A messenger had pushed open the door. "Southampton registration," said the superintendent. "Johns, get through on the phone to the Southampton police and ask them to trace the owner of this car the moment the county council offices open." The messenger disappeared and he turned on Waverley. "The number's probably a false one. A board slipped over the real number, as they did in the Dalston case, when some American toughs went through that jeweller a month or two back. We might as well look into it, though. These people are wily customers, or they wouldn't have kept you from seeing the rest of the gang. They tried to frighten us by threatening to make away with you. I think it likely that they found it rather a nuisance to look after you, especially when Green and I tumbled onto some of their people an hour ago. You haven't exactly covered yourself with glory, Waverley, but under the circumstances I shall take no disciplinary action. Now go and write out a full report and then go home. The police surgeon will recommend what leave of absence you want to get over the stab in the arm. Good night, or rather good morning." "Thank you, sir. Good morning, sir." Foyle never forgot discipline, which is as necessary, or more necessary within limits, in a detective service as in any other specialised business. To have sympathised with Waverley would have been bad policy. He had been made to feel that he had blundered in some way, and the feeling with which he had entered the room, that he was a martyr to duty, had vanished in the conviction that he was simply a fool. Foyle lit a cigar and fell into a reverie that lasted perhaps 10 minutes. He was glad that Waverley was safe, but a little disgusted that he had failed to baffle the precautions taken while he was a prisoner, and so have learnt something that might have been of value in the investigations. Presently he lifted the telephone receiver and ordered a taxicab from the all-night rank in Trafalgar Square. In a little while he was being whirled homeward. Not till midday next day did he arrive at the yard. A slip of paper was lying on his desk, the record of a telephone message from the Southampton police. It read, "Halford, Chief Constable, Southampton, to Foyle, CID, London. Car number AA4796 belongs to Mr. J. Price, The Grange, Lyndhurst. Mr. Price is an old resident in the neighbourhood and a man of means. The car is a 6-cylinder Napier." "As I thought," commented Heldon Foyle thoughtfully, tearing the paper into little bits and dropping them into the wastepaper basket. The number was a false one. They knew that Waverley would have a look at the number. Oh, these people are cunning, cunning. Green found him half an hour later, hard at work with the collection of typewritten sheets which formed the book of the case. Foyle was still juggling with his jigsaw puzzle, trying to fit fresh facts in their proper position to old facts. "Well?" asked the superintendent abruptly. Green read from a paper in his hand. "Taylor, who is watching the Duke of Burghley's house in Berkeley Square, has just telephoned that a woman who corresponds to the description of Lola Rochelle has just been admitted and is still there." Into Foyle's alert eyes there shot a gleam of interest. "You don't say so," he muttered, and then more alertly, "Is he still on the telephone? If so, tell him to detain her should she come out before I can get down. He must be as courteous as possible. We mustn't lose her now. And send a man down at once to bring Wills, the butler at Grosvenor Gardens, here. He's the only man who saw the veiled woman enter the house on the night of the murder." Chapter 19. From behind the curtains of the sitting-room, Eileen Meredith could see two men occasionally pass and repass the house. They did not go by often, but she knew that even if she could not see them, they always held the house in view. They were not journalists, they were more sedate, older men, nor did they molest anyone who entered or left the house. They merely exercised a quiet, unwearying, unobtrusive surveillance, and Eileen knew that Heldon Foyle had taken his own way of preventing her from seeing Sir Ralph Fairfield. She felt certain that were she to leave the house, the men would follow her. She did not guess, however, that Foyle had intended them to give her an opportunity of discovering their presence. She would be the more unlikely to persist in her rash resolve if she knew it would be frustrated. Nor did she know that Fairfield was equally closely watched in all his comings and goings. The hysterical outbreak that had been provoked by the superintendent's penetration of her doings when she had visited his office at Scotland Yard had been followed by hours of almost complete collapse. To her father, enough had been told to make him hurriedly summon a specialist. The doctor explained. I have known similar cases follow a great shock. She is mentally unbalanced on one point. Unless anything occurs to excite her in connection with that, time will effect a cure. She must not be opposed in her wishes, and I would suggest that she be taken out of London and an effort made to distract her. Plenty of society, outdoor amusements, anything to occupy her mind." "I suggested that we should leave London," said Lord Burleigh gloomily. "She refuses." "Then don't press her. Ask her friends to visit her, and don't let her leave the house except with a competent attendant." So it was that Eileen found herself practically a prisoner in her own home. She received the visitors invited by her father at first with a mechanical courtesy, but later on with an assumption of cheerfulness that deceived her father and even to more extent the doctor. She had begun to realize that she would never shake off the vigilance which surrounded her until she had convinced folk that she had regained her normal spirits. Her capabilities as an actress, which had won for her leading parts in many amateur plays, had never been taxed so hardly. But then she had invariably been cast for comedy. Now she felt she was playing tragedy. For night and day she never forgot. Always there was one thought hammering at her brain. She withdrew into the room as a neat little motor brougham halted at the door. In a little while Mrs. Porter Strangeways was announced. Reluctantly, Eileen condescended to welcome the portly, middle-aged dame who was tacitly recognized as being the leader of American society in London. The girl smiled brightly as the woman rose to greet her with both arms outstretched. "It is so good of you, dear Mrs. Porter Strangeways," she exclaimed. "I have only my friends to look forward to now." Mrs. Porter Strangeways indicated her companion by some subtle means of her own. "You poor girl," she exclaimed, throwing just the right reflection of sympathy into her not unmusical voice. "I called before, but you were unfit to see anyone then. I took the liberty of bringing a friend to see you, the Princess Petrovska." The name conveyed nothing to Eileen. She knew not how the woman she faced was concerned in the tangle in which she herself was involved. She saw only a slim, beautifully dressed woman whose age might have been somewhere between 30 and 40, and who still laid claim to a gypsy-like beauty. The dark eyes of the princess dwelt upon the girl with a sort of well-bred curiosity. Mrs. Porter Strangeways imparted information in a swift whisper. "A Russian title, I believe. Met her in Rome 2 years ago. She is a delightful woman, so bright and happy, though I believe, poor dear, she had a terrible time before her husband died. She called on me yesterday and asked me to bring her to see you. She's so interested in you. You don't mind?" The quick thought that she was being made a show of caused a spasm to flicker across Eileen's face. Almost instantly she regained her composure, and for half an hour Mrs. Porter Strangeways prattled on. The other took little part in the conversation. Eileen could feel that the princess was watching her closely under her cast-down eyelashes. The woman repelled and yet fascinated her. When the time came for leave-taking, she found herself giving a pressing invitation to the other to call again. With a smile of satisfaction, the princess promised. They had not been gone a quarter of an hour when the princess was announced alone. Eileen, a little astonished, received her questioningly. "I had to see you alone," explained the older woman. "I have something of importance to say to you. That's why I made Mrs. Porter Strangeways bring me. I feared that you would not see me otherwise." "To see me alone?" repeated Eileen, with the air of one completely mystified. Then, as the other nodded grimly, she closed the door of the room. With a murmured "Pardon me," the princess walked across the room and turned the key. "It will be better so," she said. "What I have to say must not be overheard. The life of someone may depend on secrecy." Eileen had begun to wonder if her strange visitor were mad. There was something, however, in her quiet, methodical manner that forbade the assumption. The Princess Petrovska had settled herself gracefully in a great armchair. "No, I am not mad," she answered the unspoken question. "I am quite in my senses, I assure you. I have come to you with a message from one you think dead, from Robert Grell." The room reeled before Eileen's eyes. She clutched the mantelpiece with one hand to steady herself. "From one I think dead," she repeated. "Bob is dead." She gripped the other woman fiercely by the shoulder and almost shook her in the intensity of her emotion. "He is dead, I tell you. What do you mean? I know he is dead. Do not lie to me. He is dead." The Princess Petrovska glanced gravely up into the strained features of the girl. Her own face was a mask. "Calm yourself, Lady Eileen," she said. "You have been made the victim of a wicked deceit. He is not dead, but a man wonderfully like him is. I have come here at his request to relieve your mind." She dropped her voice to a whisper. "At the same time, he is in grave danger, and you can help him." The girl's hands dropped to her side, and she regarded her visitor helplessly. A new hope was beginning to steal into her heart, but her reason was all on the other side. "He is dead," she protested faintly. "Fairfield killed him. Why should he hide if he is not dead? Why should he not come here himself? Why should he send you?" "Don't be a fool," retorted the other impatiently, and the impertinence of the words had the effect intended of bracing the half-fainting girl. He does not come because to do so would be madness, because if he showed himself he would be at once arrested by Scotland Yard detectives. They believe him to be the murderer of his double, a man named Goldenburg. There is a note he gave me for you." The letters danced before Eileen's eyes as she tore open the thin envelope and held what was undoubtedly Robert Grell's writing in her shaking hand. She was startled as never before in her life, save when she heard of the murder. Slowly she read, the words biting into her brain. "Dearest, forgive me for not letting you know before that I am safe. I had no means of communicating with you with safety. The man who is dead was killed by no wish of mine, yet I dared not run the risk of arrest. The bearer of this is an old friend of mine who will herself be in peril by delivering this. Trust her and destroy this. She will tell you how to keep in touch with me." There was no signature. Mechanically, Eileen tore the letter in two and dropped the fragments on the blazing fire. She felt the dark eyes of the princess upon her as she did so. A spasm of jealousy swept across her at the thought that this woman should have been trusted, should have had the privilege of helping Grell rather than herself. She strove to push it aside as unworthy. He was alive. He was alive. The thought was dominant in her mind. She could have sung for very joy. "Well?" asked the princess. "I don't understand," said Eileen wearily. "He does not explain. There is nothing clear in the note but that he is alive." "He dare say no more. That is, he's succeeded in evading the police so far. If by any chance that letter had fallen into their hands, it would have told them no more than they knew at present." "Where is he?" demanded Eileen. "I must go to him." "No, that will never do. You would be followed. I will give any message for you. You can help, but not in that way. He is in need of money. Have you any of your own? Can you let him have, say, £500 at once?" The girl reflected a moment. "There is my jewellery," she said at last. "He, or you, can raise more than 500 on that. Wait a moment." She left the room, and a smile flitted across the grave face of the princess. A few moments later she returned with a little silver casket in her hands. "And now," she said, "tell me what happened. Who killed this man Goldenburg?" The Princess Petrovska gave a dainty little shrug. "Mr. Grell shall tell you that in his own fashion," she said. "Listen." For 10 minutes she talked rapidly, now and again writing something on a slip of paper and showing it to Eileen. The girl nodded in comprehension, occasionally interjecting a question. At last the princess rose. "You fully understand?" she said. "I fully understand," echoed Eileen. Chapter 20. Heldon Foyle had been prepared to take any risk rather than allow the Princess Petrovska to escape him again. There was nothing against her but suspicion. It was for him to find evidence that might link her with the crime. It is in such things that the detective of actuality differs from the detective of fiction. The detective of fiction acts on moral certainties which would get the detective of real life into bad trouble. To arrest the princess was out of the question. Even to detain her might make matters awkward. Yet the superintendent had made up his mind to afford Wills, the butler, a sight of her at all costs. If Wills identified her, it would be at least another link in the chain of evidence that was being forged. He carried the butler in a taxicab with him to the nearest corner to the Duke of Burghley's house. A well-groomed man sauntered up to them and shook hands warmly with Foyle. "She has not come out yet," he said. "Good," exclaimed Foyle. "Come on, Wills. You have a good look at this woman when she does come out, and stoop down and tie your shoelace if she's anything like the woman who visited Robert Grell on the night of the murder. Be careful now. Don't make any mistakes. If you identify her, you'll probably have to swear to her in court." "But I never saw her face," complained Wills helplessly. "I told you I was not certain I'd know her again." He was palpably nervous and unwilling to play the prominent part that had been assigned to him. Foyle laughed reassuringly. "Never mind. You have a look at her, old chap. You never know in these cases. You may remember her when you see her. Everyone walks differently, and you may spot her by that. It won't do any harm if you don't succeed." He led Wills to a spot a few paces away from the house, but out of view of anyone looking from the windows, and gave him instructions to remain where he was. He himself returned to the corner where Taylor, the detective inspector who had greeted them when they drove up, was waiting. The other end of that side of the square was guarded by one of Taylor's assistants. Lola was trapped, if Foyle wished her to be trapped. He beckoned to a uniformed constable who was pacing the other side of the road. The man nodded, detectives whatever their rank are never saluted, and took up his position a few paces away. They had not long to wait. A taxicab whizzed up to the house, evidently summoned by telephone. Wills was staring as though fascinated at the slim, erect figure of the woman outlined on the steps of the house. He half stooped, then straightened himself up again. The superintendent muttered an oath under his breath and nodded to the loitering policeman. The constable immediately sprang into the roadway with arm outstretched, and the cab, which was just gathering way, was pulled up with a jerk. The blue uniform is more useful in some cases than the inconspicuous mufti of the CID. "Get hold of Wills and bring him after us to Malchester Row Police Station. and opening the door, he stepped within as the driver dropped in the clutch. The princess had half risen and gave a little cry of dismay at the intrusion. With grim, set face, the detective adjusted his tall form to the limits of the cab and sat down beside her. His hand encircled her wrist and he forced her back to the seat. "I shouldn't try to open the door if I were you," he said quietly. "You might fall out." The woman dropped back and did some quick thinking. She had no difficulty in guessing who Foyle was, and she could scarcely have failed to see the staring figure of the butler as she left the Duke of Burghley's house. She fenced for time, doing the astonished, outraged, half-frightened innocent to perfection. "What does this mean? How dare you molest me? Where are you taking me?" The detective smiled easily as he answered in the formal words of CID custom. "I am a police officer, perhaps I needn't tell you that, and I am taking you to Malchester Row Police Station." "To arrest me? You would dare? Do you know I am the Princess Petrovska? There is some mistake. I shall appeal to the Russian ambassador. What do you say I have done? I am a friend of Lady Eileen Meredith, the daughter of the Duke of Burghley. She will tell you I have only just left her. You are confusing me with someone else." It was admirably done. The mixture of indignation and haughtiness might have imposed upon some people, and the threat of appeal to the Russian ambassador had been very adroit. Heldon Foyle merely nodded. "This is not arrest," he replied. "It is not even detention, unless you force me to it. I am inviting you to accompany me to give an account of your movements on the night that Harry Goldenburg was murdered. I will call your bluff, Lola, and we will call at the ambassador's if you like." She made a gesture with one hand, as of a fencer acknowledging a hit, and turning her head, smiled sweetly into his face. Nevertheless, in spite of everything, she felt a little nervous. She had gone to see Eileen with her eyes not fully open to the risk she ran. Deftly used, newspapers have their uses. In supplying the story of the murder to the pressmen, Foyle had omitted all mention of the finding of the miniature. The woman had not known that Scotland Yard had a portrait of her, and had deemed it unlikely that she would be recognised by the watchers of the house. Although she had lived by her wits in many quarters of the world, she had hitherto avoided trouble with the police in England. She wondered how much Foyle knew. It was evidently of no use trying to impress him with the importance of her rank and connections. Princesses are cheap in Russia. "You are Mr. Heldon Foyle, of course," she said. "I have heard that you are very clever. I don't see what I can have had to do with the murder, even if I am Lola Rochelle, which I admit." "We shall see. Can you prove where you were between 10 o'clock, when you left the Palatial Hotel, and midnight on that date?" She laughed merrily. "You are not so clever as I thought," she exclaimed. "Do you think that I am a murderess? I went straight to an hotel near Charing Cross, the Splendid, and caught the 9 o'clock boat train to Paris. It is easily proved." Foyle shifted to the seat opposite so that he could see her face more easily. "Then you don't deny that you visited Grosvenor Gardens that night, that you were admitted by Ivan Abramovitch, Grell's valet, and taken to his study?" "Of course I do," she retorted laughingly. "If that's all you've got to go upon, you may as well let me go now." "Very well, we shall see," he answered. The cab stopped at Malchester Row Police Station.